The topic we will be discussing is whether utilitarianism is the only way to properly and fairly build society. The question itself actually entails two issues. We will first examine the pros and cons of utilitarianism to see whether it builds society properly and fairly. Then we will contrast it with other philosophical views to see if only one can be adopted and applied in a society, are there better principles to build the society upon? Before addressing the first issue, we need first to look at what exactly is utilitarianism. Founded by an English moral philosopher, Jeremy Bentham, utilitarianism considers the highest principle of morality to be whatever will maximize utility. In other words, whatever produces the greatest amount of pleasure or happiness for the greatest number of people. Classical utilitarianism can be summed up in three propositions. The morality of an action depends solely on the consequences of the action. Nothing else matters. An action's consequences matter only insofar as they involve the greater or lesser happiness of individuals. In the assessment of consequences, each individual's happiness gets equal consideration. Two main criticisms have been raised by other schools of philosophy on the foundations of utilitarianism. Firstly, from the deontologist perspective, it's wrong for utilitarianism to treat people as mere instruments of the collective happiness. An action should be immoral because it violates the supreme human rights or is intrinsically injustice, not because it fails to produce maximized happiness. With the controversial lifeboat case, even if a lot of us would have done the exact same thing, we, along with the judge, still felt wrong to kill a person despite the motives and consequences, because greater good should not be achieved at the expense of life. Secondly, utilitarianism has a single standard, happiness. However, happiness is not the only things that matter. For instance, deontologists may feel that duty is more important than pleasure, or libertarians view people's freedom of choice as a top priority. To ignore all the other factors and simply consider happiness will inevitably result in superficial pursuit of consequences, something we cannot control, and selfish calculations. Even if we accept the foundations of utilitarianism, the application of such principle can also be problematic in the real world. One of the major criticisms is that it overlooks individual rights. When private rights conflict with public interests, utilitarianism would morally choose public interests, which is obviously in contradiction with current trend to protect human rights and individual integrity, and to avoid the tyranny of the majority. The proper and fair society that we want is not the city of happiness, but one that respects diversity and gives voice to minorities as well. In addition to that, it is impossible to translate all moral goods into a single currency of value without losing something important in the translation. Utilitarian logic is applied in cost-benefit analysis. In reality, however, not all values can be translated and calculated by a common currency of value. How much should a life cost? In a Stephen Avery case, how much does wasting 18 years in prison as an innocent man cost? Does that cost more or less than letting a potential criminal go free? Is torture morally more expensive than the information yielded, which could potentially save millions? Utilitarianism also has several defenses regarding those four criticisms above. Firstly, according to Locke, humans enjoy certain natural rights born with them, like the right to life, freedom, or property. However, by signing a social contract and forming a collective community, we yield some of our natural rights in exchange for social rights protected by our community. A society that only looks at people for their individuality is one with an isolated view and no efficiency or any functionality whatsoever, because the inherent divergence between us will render any decision impossible. Secondly, a lot of people only know the concept of happiness by its sound and habitually reject it in some of its forms, of beauty, of ornament, or of amusement, which is basically straw person fallacy. The happiness being talked about in utilitarianism is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain and as rich as possible in enjoyments, both in point of quantity and quality, both in pursuit of higher pleasures and prevention of unhappiness. Duty, freedom, or any other morally worthy goals are good because they contribute to the overall and ultimate happiness of the human race. As for the libertarianism criticism, it is not so much of an attack on utilitarianism itself, rather than wrong application of such principle. Liberalists object to translating rights into worthy of little, but valuing direct, short-term social interests much more. We can still build a fair and proper society based on utilitarianism, as long as we rethink about the price tags attached by current practice. In answer to the last criticism, it is indeed true that values and morals cannot and should not be translated in monetary terms. However, a qualitative categorization of what's good and bad is not enough for society. We also need quantifiable standards so that a decision can still be made when we cannot have all the good things we desire. We want to save all 5 people on the railway, but we cannot. We want to protect national security while giving suspected terrorists the rights and treatment granted by the Constitution, but we can't. Just because insurance companies have a set standard of compensation for people passed away does not mean they also think it moral to take someone's life for the same amount of money. The utilitarianism principle works the same way. When we cannot have it all, what is the more right thing to do? None of the other principles give a clear answer to that. The most controversial and widely debated issue in recent years is probably the need for law enforcement to protect national security and social order versus the privacy and individual rights of citizens. Dating back centuries, the issue has already made an impact. Ernest Hemingway, the renowned novelist, shot himself in the head because he had been paranoid about the FBI monitoring him, believing that everything around him was bugged and even afraid to use phone and mail. Years later, FBI released a 127-page file on Hemingway since the 1940s, confirming he was watched with a warrant by agents working for President Hoover, who took a personal interest in his case over suspicions of Hemingway's links to Cuba. A recent battle between FBI and Apple is only one of a great many cases continuing this debate. The FBI wants to bypass security on the iPhone belonging to a confirmed terrorist, Farouk, who, along with his spouse, killed 14 people in San Bernardino last year and swore allegiance to ISIS. But Apple's boss, Tim Cook, refused the request for fear that if a precedent is set, backdoors could be forced into their code, and FBI would surveil not only terrorists, but also ordinary people without any supervision, which is a legitimate concern when you think about the PRISM project exposed by Edward Snowden. The fact that Hemingway is innocent but Farouk is not is irrelevant in this debate. As technology and legal system have developed over the years, forensic measures and warrant requirements have greatly increased the accuracy of police suspicions and the limitations on their surveillance on civilians. Meanwhile, people have never valued privacy more than today. From Electronic Communications Privacy Act to Patriot Act, the executive keeps trying to push the boundaries of what law enforcement should be allowed to do when the circumstances call for an action, while the Supreme Court keeps pushing back. In a recent 2014 Riley v. California case, it ruled against the police in searching the phone data of an arrested criminal with gang affiliation. A reasonable, objective person should want government to have the authority to intrude the privacy of certain people as long as that power is under strict public scrutiny to avoid arbitrary abuse. Deontologists believe that the end does not justify the means, or that we have a duty to protect the privacy of a citizen, which is something justified despite the conditions. However, the warrantless search of a phone can only be justified when we consider the good consequences. But don't we all want to live in a safer society where the police can do more than just sit on their hands with information that could potentially save millions, reduce the violence cast on our land, and possibly one day on ourselves? Utilitarianism gives a solution. We do not desire invasion of civic privacy, but the national security and lives of innocent people we do. Since the act benefits more people and creates more happiness than doing nothing, we should be justified in doing this. Overall, we do not argue for utilitarianism to be a perfect principle to build our society upon. Nothing is, really. But we do believe that it builds a relatively fair and proper society that none other can compare. There is inequality and sometimes injustice, but we would much rather live in this utilitarian but functioning society than any other imaginary idealist world.